have two last sessions of today together. And first, we had planned speech of Alexander Mramonov, but Professor Vassiliadis will explain us what happened with him.
First of all, we expected too much the archival work that he has been done about the Great Synod before the Bolshevik Revolution. One of the main issues that has been discussed in that Great Sabor, as they call it, which brought back the patriarchy and abolished this connection with the state created by the Tsar Peter the Great, was the issue of deaconesses. All, however, we know about deaconesses was from secondary sources. Alexander Mramonov was responsible for editing in Russian all the minutes of this section about deaconesses. 2 years ago, he announced this, and I asked him in a future Deaconesses symposium or conference to present this. And he responded positively. However, we have not so far as yet managed to have any contact with him. He is not in. So this is what this is why we decided to merge the two sessions, and if Zoya can tell something to the participants in addition to her presentation about this decision of the 1918 Great Synod just before or during the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution, because it is very much related to our research, to our subject. This is what I wanted to say first.
Thank you, Professor. So we call Professor Zoya Dastetskaya. You have the floor, please. Yes.
Just make a short review, and then we'll show your presentation. Okay. For 10 minutes, I'll show review, and then
so can I start?
Yes, you can. You can sit if you like. Before you start, we'll show the summary in Greek. 1 minute. Okay.
So can I start?
You start.
So, Your Eminence, dear fathers, dear colleagues, my presentation named Women's Diaconia in the context of community and brotherhood ecclesiology. So the question of women's ministry is in our day and age fairly well discussed in the academic literature from the perspective of early Christian, patristic, liturgical, and canonical sources. The question has been well researched and worked through. From the standpoint of history, the issue from each of these perspectives is fairly well delineated. In Russian language, thanks to the works of Elena Belikova and her colleagues, Father Andrei Pasternak, and many, many others, a significant amount of material has been gathered on the ministry of women during the time of the Russian Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries, And of even more value are the materials from the Soviet period, given the broad context of church-state relations, data on canonical rights, the sociological perspective, etc. Attempts have been made to gather information on the service of women during difficult periods of persecution against the church, insofar as these materials are, for the most part, disparate and available only as part of the oral history. But they do exist, and it is possible for us to access them. In modern theological reflections from the 20th and 21st centuries, women's ministry is considered not from a sociological point of view, for the most part, but from the perspective of an embodiment of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. We can see, for instance, Father Nicholas Afanasiev, Metropolitan Callistus Ware, Father Thomas Hopko, Elizabeth Bersigel, Olivier Clément, Kyriaki Fitzgerald, Despina Prasas, Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, and others. During the second half of the 20th century, in various ecumenical circles, the question of the ordaining women deaconesses via sacramental ordination or the laying on of hands was discussed with Orthodox participation. And we have examples of use of the right for ordaining deaconesses, not only in the 19th century Russian Church, but also in the 20th century during the period of persecution. But, thank you.
Will you use this?
Yeah. Which? What should I press? This one. But it seems as if consideration of the questions of the status of women in the church and appropriate women's ministries are really only stepping stones toward the consideration of much deeper aspects of a fundamental issue. As Professor Vassiliadis notes, today as ever, our situation absolutely requires a constant search for theological, historical, and academically respectable answers to an open issue which is inhibiting the Church's witnesses in the 21st centuries. Centuries-old prejudices, pseudo-theological arguments, and cultural habit are no longer sufficiently convincing for our fast-changing world, which hungers and thirsts for truth. According to Elena Belikova, today Western European experience of women's ministry remains key for the Orthodox tradition, while Orthodox women's experience of tenacity, persistence, and remaining firm in their faith is of particular significance for the European Christian world. In our opinion, today's church is being called to answer a more general question which forms the broader context for our question about women's ministries. The question which it is vital for us to answer is this: do current church practice and order really enable the action of the Spirit of God and promote the flourishing of the fullness of spiritual gifts within our contemporary church? For as the holy martyr Saint Irenaeus of Lyon has said, for where the church is, there is the Spirit of God, and where the Spirit of God is, there is the church and every kind of grace, which implies the gift of the Spirit and church ministries. Some words about the ecclesiological contexts of women's ministries. What do women's ministries look like in various different manifestations of church? Our short summary is no way aspires to be a qualified and detailed analysis of all aspects of the question of women's ministries within the church. It's more a stepping stone to setting the theological stage for considering all aspects of the question. It's by no means a coincidence, we believe, that the question of women's diaconia is at present being considered primarily as a question of ordination. There is of the fixed institutionalized position of a minister of the church, and also the degree to which women can participate in the celebration of the holy mysteries. It is probably for this reason that the question of women priests had been practically shunted entirely outside the framework of our current discussion, insofar as the question of non-institutional eldership is difficult even to speak about or describe within the framework of the discourse about canons. We note immediately that the experience of the old believers in Russia, which Elena Belikova has gathered and studied, as well as that of new martyrs and confessors of the Russian Church during the period of persecution, paves the way for broadening the theological contexts for our issue. It would seem that it is ecclesiological contexts, that is our assumptions about the form that church can take, dictate something of our approach to parameters insofar as this offering of service, as with any ministry, exists only within the church. It logically follows that the contents of this ministry and its place in the church are determined by our own views and personal experience of church and the fullness of the ministers within it. At the present time, for the perspective of contemporary Orthodox theology and church practice, it is possible to identify various differing ecclesiological models which are coexisting, though not always in perfect peace, and we do sometimes witness arguing. In our case, we draw support on recent developments that represent private theological opinion and do not pretend to be some sort of ultimate knowledge as regards the question at hand. One authority on ecclesiology in modern Russia is Father Georgy Kochetkov, rector of our institute, a scholar who is known to many because of his work in developing an integral and consistent system of introducing the foundations of the Christian faith, prayer and life, that is catechesis, to adults in the modern world. Thanks to this system, thousands, even tens of thousands of people in Russia have come into the church and become practicing Christians over the last 45 years. The final stage of catechesis is a traditional introduction to the mysteries of the church, mystagogy. The central theme of which is ecclesiology, forms the foundation of personal faith and the church faith in the New Testament church. Within the framework of this stage of catechesis, Father Georgy teaches that there are various different types of Orthodox ecclesiology, drawing attention to the following types: clerical, hierarchical, localized parish, diocesan, localized Eucharistic, and community brotherhood, suggesting that there are theological foundations and basic traits by which each of the types can be characterized. Various other theologians have also separately considered various ecclesiological types, including Father John Baer, Father John Erickson, and Father Valentin Asmus, Russian scientist and priest. Insofar as Father Georgy proposed approach to typological classification is more highly differentiated and developed, we will use it as a reference point in this paper. Father Georgy believes that one characteristic of our era, as of very other era of the church's existence and history, is that in real life, I quote, "In real life there has never been, is not, and never can be only one ecclesiological model." It follows that in every era we are dealing with a complex combination, intersection and mixture of different ecclesiological models, and we must therefore keep in mind all this complexity and variation in the ecclesiological context under which the question is posed. And we repeatedly endeavor to consider women's ministry at the level of the church in general. Thus, let us look at our opportunities for making the women's diaconia a reality within the framework of various different ecclesiological models. It is completely clear that within the framework of a clerical hierarchical understanding of church order, that women's ministry women's ministry doesn't find a place in the church in any form, whether institutional or outside the framework of one or another ordained position. The somewhat degraded form of church order which prevails today, as Father Georgy writes, is non-essentially strict and simultaneously tolerant of lawlessness both within and without. I quote, the leaven of the Pharisees can only lead to a complete objectification of the spirit and its subsequent extreme cooling, either toward church fundamentalism or into secularism. It is particularly, as I quote, a strictly verticalized hierarchical authority, he continues, a clerical hierarchical but absolutely impersonal ecclesiology that can only ever be appropriate to the external institution manifestation of church with its jurisdictional boundaries and borders. The end of the quote. Within this type of the church structure, a woman is a free app for your lampstand and no more. That is, she can work as a cleaner in the church, though not in the altar, sell candles, and collect prayer lists to pass on to the priests. She can also sing in the choir, and in post-Soviet Russia, this was perhaps the only place in which she could really serve God. And even this was only because of the fact that in the immediate aftermath of the 1000th anniversary of the baptism of Rus, many churches were suddenly opened, and there were hardly any men in the Russian church. Within the framework of this ecclesiological model, a woman is assigned a subordinate role and the only field in which she can manifest herself with appropriate dignity is as a mother and a wife within the family, in giving birth to children, mothering them, and in caring for her husband. As such, Father Andrei Tkachev, very famous priest in Russian Orthodox Church today, preacher, who is now popular in fundamentalist circles, says directly in his sermons, which are published via one of Orthodox websites, popular websites, that, I quote, there were no women among the apostles, and no female people are ever called to be apostles. There are deep, divine foundations for this, and it is also true that priesthood is not given to women. The end of the quote. Though even he notes that, I quote, women are not barred from spreading the gospel. And Father Dmitry Smirnov, head of the Patriarchal Commission for Family Issues and the Defense of Motherhood and Childhood, is one more name for the same camp. He, a well-known critic of birth control, declared on public radio that, I quote, women are weaker of mind than men, making an exception only for Marie Curie. We note, however, that Smirnov's statement earned a publicly announced negative reaction from official Russian Orthodox Church representatives. Within the context of a localized parish ecclesial order, Father Georgi believes that, I quote, life on all levels within the church, whether parish, diocesan, or localized autonomous, is directly tied to the administrative, housekeeping, social, political, state, governmental, or national borders. Moreover, he stresses local division into dioceses is expressed through the inviolable one city, one bishop rule. And the localized parish order through the parish for which a localized territorial community is understood as the primary cellular building block of the entire church organism or the entire church organization, the end of the quote. As such, within the framework of localized parish ecclesiology, a woman can only realize her ministry to God in rigid institutional forms. And this takes the particular form of monasticism and no more. All other forms of women's ministry are rejected as being suspicious in some way or another, insofar as they are not recognized by either church or state. Thus, the well-known 19th century church luminary Metropolitan Filaret Drozdov initially reacted very carefully to the idea of restoring the women's diaconesses, when it seems necessary for building a mission in the Altai, and to the activity of women as Archimandrit Makary Glukharev expressed it to him, though he didn't forbid women from acting as missionaries under Archimandrit Makary. Nevertheless, at a later date, he himself came to the point of taking decisive action in 1840, which he consecrated the head of Spaso-Bogoroditsky monastery, Mother Maria. She was a noble woman, Margarita Mikhailovna Tuchkova, as abbess, using the right for the ordination of a deaconess, making use the words повели, повелите, various imperative forms of the very lead shepherd, and pronounced her axios 3 times, after which she was adorned with the oration, with the horarion of a deacon. Her memories of that occasion have been preserved. Of course, it also makes sense to mention here the proposals of Archimandrit Makary, which were partially put into practice. It was common for women to prepare other women for baptism, and those who performed the ministry were not given any institutional office, but as a result became members of monastic communities. And it is no coincidence that another remarkable priest, this is Archimandrit Makary, another remarkable priest, Father Alexander Gumilevsky, from the Church of the Birth of Christ, of the Nativity of Christ in St. Petersburg, was having similar thoughts. Father Alexander put a great deal of effort into transforming the charitable sisterhood of the Elevation of the Holy Cross into a community of Orthodox Deaconesses. Himself deeply convinced of the traditional nature of the Institute of Deaconesses within the Orthodox Church, he tried to bring it back to life, though he was unsuccessful in doing so. He laid out a plan for the constitution of this community, of the Elevation of the Holy Cross, and with all his might tried to get it approved in the upper echelons of the church, knowing that there are developed and self-sacrificial women ready to follow the path. Father Alexander thought that a restoration of the office of deaconesses would be supported by the whole Orthodox Church. I quote, because the unified voice of all the universal church councils supports the institution. The end of the quote. He was certain that women's monasticism does not solve the problem of women's ministry in general, and therefore strove to create a community of parish deaconesses. But in this attempt, he was also unsuccessful. Father Alexander died in 1869 without having received permission to create a community of deaconesses. The example described above bear witness to the fact that within the context of a localized parish ecclesiology, the idea of the restoration of the institution of women's ministry may gather some private support, though particularly under conditions in which the church is dependent upon the state. These private initiatives are unlikely to be embodied or find any sort of longevity. To all such initiatives arising within Russia during the 19th and 20th century and before the cope of 1917, the Synod reacted with one question: why the Institute of the Diaconate for Women when we already have women's monasteries on the one hand and the charitable sisterhoods on the other hand? So it turns out that there is no room for any institution of women's church ministry other than that which implies the taking of monastic vows within the framework of a localized parish ecclesiology. And this is true even at the parish level, because the parish is not self-sufficient and independent so that it can take decisions in matters regarding such questions. Insofar, in any ministry under this type of ecclesial model presupposes attachment to institutional forms, and these same forms lost women's ministry over the course of their own history. They can no longer perceive women's ministry when it is needful, the ministry of a deaconesses rather than a monastic or a sister of charity. Drawing some preliminary conclusions, we can say that the order of deaconesses during the Russian synodal period had no prospects of being restored on the level of the church as a whole, and the collection of unsuccessful attempts at its restoration during the 19th and early 20th century bear witness to this fact. We get a whole different perspective on our topic from the perspective of the post-Constantinian period. And it is no accident that the integral concept of Eucharistic ecclesiology poses the question of women's ministry anew, and not only from the institutional standpoint. As Father Georgi understands it, I quote, localized Eucharistic ecclesiology is based upon the central significance of the unified mystery of the Eucharist, which is understood as the mystery of mysteries, and the corresponding united Eucharistic assembly of the Church, as well as on the practice of territoriality, one city, one bishop, one Eucharist, and one Eucharistic assembly. Although Eucharistic locality is more linked to local common mutual spiritual life, соборность, and the church community itself is more, I quote, the church in all its fullness, that it is some part of some universal whole, in line with the ancient Christian principle, where the Eucharist is, there also is the church. Eucharistic ecclesiology as an integral and well-developed theological concept arises from the work of Father Sergei Bulgakov and Father Nikolai Afanasyev, that is out of the Russian emigration in Paris. Father John Baer believes that the appearance of Eucharistic ecclesiology out of the Paris Theological Academy was to a great degree tied to the fate of the emigration itself, and as a result, the gathering all the strands of the church around the Eucharist. It was the Eucharist in particular that became the means of uniting Russian people who had lost their fatherland and habitual world order, having found themselves in a foreign land. At that moment, for representatives of the Russian church in emigration, the Eucharist concentrated within itself the embodiment of the sobornal principles of church life. And logically, therefore, Father Sergei Bulgakov called the conference of youth movement in Psherov Pentecost. It is within the context of a Eucharistic ecclesiology that future new martyr Mother Maria Skoptsova set up her work. Her diaconia and outbuilding of the house of Rulurmel, and the organization that she founded, Pravoslavное дело, Orthodox doing, were inspired by the idea of liturgy outside the church. She herself described the work using liturgical language. I quote of Mother Maria. On the level known to the public, Pravoslavное дело can only be a common affair, a sort of liturgy projected from the church into the world. And the second quote, we love one another and confess unity of thought. Loving one another means not only unity in thought, but unity in action. It means a common life. Moreover, in describing the fairly difficult work of going to market in the pre-dawn darkness and coming back toting a heavy sack of inexpensive food for those in her shelter on her back, when something begins to leak out of the bag, she describes it using the word liturgy. She will take anyone at all into her shelter, thereby expanding the mystical boundaries of the church. For the diaconia conceived of by her as a sort of and all-expansive new motherhood, there are no canonical, juridical, or faith confessional divisions and borders. Mother Maria was also verbally talented. Thus, Metropolitan Evlogy Georgievsky blessed her to preach at the end of the liturgy. Father Georgi believes that, I quote, it is this type of ecclesiology in particular which best of all perceives and brings into relief the mystical dogmatic borders of the church. Though it seems that in her ministry, Mother Maria even surpasses these, to which her martyr's death bears eloquent witness. It is therefore natural that Mother Maria spoke of evangelical ecclesiology, which in essence surpasses a Eucharistic ecclesiology that has, as we know, its limitations. This type of ecclesiological model is well documented in church history. Women deaconesses can celebrate in the Eucharist, take Holy Communion to those who are ill, perform chrismation of women in completing the mystery of baptism, and pass on catechetical teaching. The history of the church contains many examples of such ministry, and they appear in liturgical canonical records. It is within a Eucharistic understanding of church sobornost and the fullness of church life in particular, that women during the Soviet period were entrusted with the holy gifts and passed them to those in prison. On the whole, women's ministry within the context of this type of ecclesiology opens the door for Christian sisters to act within the sacramental boundaries of the church. And the central place in this type of ministry and in its theological understanding is occupied by the Eucharist itself. Here, a woman's sex is a particular limitation for her, of course, though the character of women's diaconia are known to contemporary Orthodox thought specifically in the context of Eucharistic ecclesiology. The theological question as an endeavor to understand the boundaries of women's ministry and simultaneously facilitate the manifestation of women's ministries to the fullest extent possible, more often than not presupposes the context of the mysteries of the church, which means we naturally run into the issue of how theologically to reconcile hierarchical and non-hierarchical understandings of ministry. Evangelical, as Mother Maria and Nicholas Berdyaev calls it, or Trinitarian, as Father Dimitru Staniloe calls it, or community brotherhood ecclesiology, as Anatoly Zhurakovsky, Father Vitaly Borovoi, and Father Georgy Kochetkov are saying, was unveiled somewhat earlier than Eucharistic ecclesiology. Within the framework of this ecclesiological model, each is called to serve. Each is called to serve according to the gifts he or she has been given, independent of sex. We might characterize this ecclesiological model as theocentric and simultaneously Trinitarian. Ecclesiology, I quote Father Georgy, addressed to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is also addressed to the human person born again in the Holy Trinity, insofar as we believe in one indivisible God expressed in three non-intermingled hypostases and in mankind in Christ. I quote. This ecclesiological model is simultaneously Christocentric and pneumocentric, having simultaneous communal and personal traits. And the church and its borders on this understanding are determined primarily in existential categories. I quote, where love is and freedom, truth and life are, the two is the church. Within the framework of this ecclesiological model, the ministry of each is called out in accordance with his or her spiritual gift, insofar as these spiritual gifts are undertaken in Christ. And only in serving God and the church is the unsolvable opposition of male and female solved. Here is an example from the 20th century. Maria Nikolaevna Umanets became the guardianess of the elevation of the Holy Cross Brotherhood of Labor, founded by her brother, church luminary Nikolai Neplyuev. Nikolai Neplyuev is in the center of this picture, and his younger sister, Maria Umanets. She led the whole brotherhood after Neplyuev's death. And this is the council of the brotherhood. You see, Duma, Brotherhood Duma. This photo is before 1907. And all of them, brothers and sisters, have a cross. You see. They are not priests. They are lay people, men and women. Yeah, all of them. You know that this cross was a gift of Tsar Nicholas II in the 300th anniversary of the Imperia. And after that, only after that, Russian priest has this cross, yeah. So that's normal. Being an aristocrat, Neplyuev, and the Brotherhood's guardian, he called himself blюститель as episcop, but in Russian blюститель, who is guarded. Yeah. And the members of the Holy Synod of the Church called him that, blюститель. He, being an aristocrat and the Brotherhood's guardian, member as per internal status, invited graduates of agricultural schools, which he had founded, to join the Brotherhood, and later passed all his wealth and property to the brothers. At the local church council in 1917-1918, future new martyr and member of the governing body, Duma, Father Alexander Sekundov, who had been chosen by his diocese to attend the council, greeted the council in the name of the guardianess of this brotherhood, the leader of their governing body, Maria Umanets, who was the elder within the brotherhood right up until the time of the repression, which made execution of this office impossible. The text of the greeting is published in a series of documents from the local council, which Alexander Bramranov published. On the 19th of January, 1918, Patriarch Tikhon appealed to Orthodox Christians to form spiritual unions and brotherhoods. His call was heard by clerics and lay people and received an energetic response. In the communities and brotherhoods founded by Bishop Catechist Makary Apotsky, he is in the center, and which lived under his unquestionable spiritual leadership, elderhood was often borne by sisters, despite the fact that these brotherhoods also had male members. It is known that Bishop Makary ordained one such woman as a deaconess. Unfortunately, the exact day of her consecration and the rite used are impossible to recover, though we know it was before 1941. In one of the prayers written in this brotherhood by a sister and addressed to the Mother of God, she requests, I quote, "the gift of the apostles, having received strength from above, to go and proclaim the gospel of the kingdom of God." I quote. There are also other testimonies to the consecration of deaconesses during the period of persecution in the book of Elena Belikova. Under conditions of persecution, it was women in particular who became the guardians of not only the church's practice, but of the faith, of prayers and the Christian life in general, of the church's holy tradition. In the work of Elena Belikova, as well as in memories and testimonies published over the course of the last 20 years in Russia, we find many examples of spiritual mentoring being exercised by women, more often than not by those who had chosen a monastic path, to remain unmarried, or even the path of the Holy Fool. These women gathered believers around themselves, that is the Krasheninnikov sisters, who voluntarily chose a life of celibacy. That is, they directly served the assembly of the church. Now we have the example of, so you see the Father Sergius Mechov in the center of his community with brothers and sisters. And Metropolitan Veniamin of St. Petersburg with brothers and sisters. And he's a metropolitan within the communion of male and female. Some words in the end of Transfiguration Brotherhood. So I will show you some pictures maybe. Now we have an experience, a real life experience, over 30 years of Brotherhood Life in the Transfiguration Brotherhood, which will celebrate its 30th birthday in 2020. Among women, no one of these has been ordained or consecrated to their ministry, only blessed. Some of the members, women members of Transfiguration Brotherhood are married, and some have consciously chosen not to marry. As of today, we can give testimony responsibly before God to the good fruits which these women have brought and continue to bring on their path on service and as members of living church communities and brotherhoods. This is the way of witness Christ to unbelievers, the unbaptized and those of other faiths. Our sisters have experience of personal witness to unbelieving family members. The experience of running a full course of catechesis for adults, both men and women, can also be called a ministry in its own right, to which we might add the instruction of children, teenagers, and people with various developmental particularities or difficult psychiatric diagnoses. I stress that I am speaking about bringing these people fully into the church so that they become real members of a church fellowship. Another ministry of church eldership under conditions where the elder member of the small Christian group is chosen to serve for a period of 1 year, either by unanimous or simply majority vote. The group's decision must meet various criteria relating to their life in the church, responsibility, ability to care for all and not only for one's own, and for the community in a broader context. In 136 small groups and communities in our brotherhood, in our Transfiguration Brotherhood, we have 76 elder sisters in all of them. So during church worship services, sisters may not only sing and read. The primary concern of sisters who are choir leaders and members is to help people pray. That is fully entered into the church's tradition of communing with God and of communal prayer. We would also note the service of spiritual teaching and the education of lay people in forms recognized by the state government. Sisters who are members of the brotherhood not only receive a spiritual education in their own right, but also organize the educational process, which in light of the current Russian law is something of a spiritual achievement or podvig. At the level of primary, secondary, and higher spiritual educations, teaching various disciplines, including the Holy Scriptures, liturgics, church history, and other subjects. We also have sisters who are research scholars. And sisters have in recent times acquired a very particular role in service in dialogue between church and society in modern Russia, now in Russia. This involves putting forward various initiatives which have a Christian basis and the expression of well thought through Christian position in non-church circles. A short review of ecclesiological types of church order bears witness to the fact that in practice, the restoration of the fullness of women's ministry cannot happen simply. Definitively, or in a uniform way in all instances and churches. However, there are spiritually sensitive examples from past years that show us that institutional ordination is possible when there is a pre-existing existing church ministry already attested to within a specific church assembly. A number of questions remain, however, for instance, that of the form of women's Christian participation in church administration and of their church representation within official structures. If we are speaking about ministries which presupposed women participation in the celebration of the church mysteries, preparation for baptism, service in the context of the church assembly, then on what basis can a women Christian be recommended for such a ministry? By whom and how would it be attested and accepted into the life of the church? The act of consecration, in all likelihood, should presuppose election and various specific demands. But as we well understand, it is hardly true that all aspects of the church ministry of women today will fit neatly into the Byzantine rite of consecrating a deaconess that is well known to researchers of the Theologian Barberini. It seems likely that the consecration of deaconesses will be more closely linked with the ministries relating to the field of catechesis, philanthropic charitable work, and perhaps the services handled by junior clerics. The other aspects of women's ministry within the church, which in the church of the past perhaps fell under the services of women presbyters, widows, and virgins, will unlikely fit into the office of the deaconesses. Yeah. So this is hardly a full list of questions for our agenda. If we really want to attempt to bring various church initiatives and all the restoration of women's ministries to fruition. There are many questions remaining, it seems, but let's not let this get in the way of researchers or those who in practice are searching to reveal the will of God. As Professor Vassiliadis noted, this doesn't have to do with what women or men want, but with what Jesus Christ wants for the church in the 21st century for the glory of God. And this search is the search we must lead in the light of a viable and respectable theological anthropology based on the authentic, the hidden holy tradition of the church and not only on historical tradition. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zoya. Although you have exceeded the time allocated to you, and we apologize to our next speaker, who is one of the most important persons within the Catholic Church in her attempt to revive the order of women deacons after the decision of Pope Francis to open again this question. Immediately, we are going to ask Phyllis to join in, and hello. One question I would like to ask you. I have translated, or not myself, but Professor Antonia Kyriazi has translated your presentation. What do you prefer for the Greek-speaking audience? To project it or leave it and distribute it as a draft document? We don't hear.
This is, Professor. Whatever you wish to do.
While you will...
You have to unmute me. Okay, now I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Unmuted. Practice, whatever you think is best.
While you are presenting in English your paper, I would suggest that the Greek-speaking can have exactly, it's okay for you?
Whatever, sure.
Okay, okay, okay. You can start.
Well, that's not mine.
Just 1 minute to find your, yeah, this is exactly.
Okay. Okay.
And you can start presenting your paper. And
well,
we are very grateful for accepting, not accepting, but willing, for being willing to participate in this symposium.
Well, I'm just delighted to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to join with you in discussing this question, because as you know, we have a common tradition. It's our church, East and West. You've asked me to speak about women deacons in the Roman Catholic Church. So women, you know, as we know, have been in the Catholic consciousness since the restoration of the diaconate as a permanent vocation after the Second Vatican Council. There's never been any doubt that women deacons existed and ministered in various ways in multiple locations, east and west, throughout our church's long history. However, within the Catholic churches, and especially within the Roman Catholic churches, the type and nature of the ministries of women deacons, as well as the nature of their ordinations, have been repeatedly analyzed and debated. Most recently, the question was addressed by the Pontifical Commission for the Study of the Diaconate of Women, which met several times in Rome from November 2016 to June 2018. As you know, I was a member of that commission. I am a member of that commission. So we have the post-conciliar debate. There was some informal discussion about restoring the tradition of women deacons during the Second Vatican Council. But the council only recommended the restoration of the male diaconate as a permanent office, which would be open to both celibate and married men. However, the question of women deacons hovered in the rarefied post-conciliar air. In the 1970s, the Belgian professor Roger Grison, who is now ordinary professor emeritus of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Louvain, published a book, The Ministry of Women in the Early Church. Grison found that women were ordained to the diaconate and performed diaconal ministries for many centuries. Although he presented their ministries as somewhat more limited than those of their male counterparts, Grison found in the ordinations of women deacons, and I quote, nothing distinguishing it formally from the ordination of their male colleagues. Coincidentally, in Rome, Pope Paul VI asked the noted Eastern liturgist and member of the International Theological Commission, Cipriano Vagaggini, about women deacons. In his dense essay, eventually published in Orientalia Christiana Periodica, Vagaggini concluded that the women deacons, or deaconesses, belonged to the group of bishops, presbyters, and deacons, not to the lesser clergy, and that they received and can receive diaconal ordination equal to that of deacons. Vagaggini responded to the point of historical restrictions to the ministry of women by affirming that contemporary society accepts ministries once denied women, especially distributing communion. He wrote, quote, "It is noteworthy that today there are cases in which, by indult, women do almost everything that can be done by the clergy, except say Mass, hear confessions, and do the anointing of the sick." Vagaggini, in fact, notices that this later restriction against anointing the sick affirms the Western idea of anointing regarding the remission of sin and relegates to a secondary status the sacramental intent of obtaining healing from God. Then, some years later, and in an attempt to overtake the growing acceptance of women deacons in accord with the restoration of the diaconate as a permanent ministry for men, French liturgist Georges Marimort produced a book-length compilation of his essays and other writings refuting Grison. Even so, Marimort concludes, quote, "Theologians must strictly guard against trying to prove hypotheses dependent upon only a part of the documentation available," and, quote, "There exists a significant danger of distorting both the facts and the texts whenever one is dealing with them secondhand." The discussion about women in the diaconate seems to have been waylaid by growing calls for women to be ordained as priests during the last quarter of the 20th century, which saw the publication of 2 documents affirming church teaching against the possibility of women priests. The International Theological Commission document Inter Seniores in 1976, and the Apostolic Exhortation of John Paul II, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis in 1994. Each document expressly eliminated any discussion of women deacons. The International Theological Commission. In 1992, the International Theological Commission, the ITC, set out to settle the question of women deacons. By 1997, the 9-member all-male subcommittee found no objections to women deacons and in fact presented a numbered and printed document that the entire ITC voted to affirm. However, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, CDF, and the ITC president refused to promulgate the findings. Cardinal Ratzinger created a new subcommittee. He named the Reverend Alicta Nerona Galveo, one of his former graduate students, as its chair, and promulgated their greatly expanded document in 2002. The document concludes that 1, men and women deacons did not perform exactly the same duties. 2, the diaconate is not the priesthood. 3, the matter of women deacons is something the ministry of discernment that the Lord has left his church to decide. That is, the subcommittee did not say no. It just did not say yes. Then the question of women deacons in the Catholic churches languished through 2 papacies. John Paul II, Pope, when the second ITC document appeared in 2002, did nothing before his death in 2005. Benedict XVI, who reigned until his resignation in 2013, also did nothing. However, in a footnote to his recent letter marking the 50th anniversary of the ITC, the International Theological Commission, the retired pontiff stated that the Eastern Catholic churches were polled on the matter without result, apparently during his term at CDF. Meanwhile, a few academics and other writers took up the discussion about Catholic women deacons from time to time. Both the Canon Law Society of America in 1995 and the Catholic Theological Society of America in 1997 considered women deacons. My own work began to appear in 2000, and it assumed the proven history in focusing on questions related to sacramental theology and pastoral need. Subsequent writing argued against the restoration of women to the ordained diaconate, and it often turns and continues to turn to Marty Mort, whose research was completed prior to 1982. So come along the synods and the International Union of Superiors General. The most intriguing entries into the recent discussion have come from official and semi-official quarters. At the October 2015 Synod of Bishops on the Family in Rome, Canadian Archbishop Paul-André Durocher presented a strong intervention on behalf of the dignity of women. Durocher presented strong proposals to the Synod. First, that women be appointed to curial positions. Second, that the permanent diaconate be open to women. Even so, resistance in Rome was deep. For example, the French-English Vatican spokesman did not mention Archbishop Durocher's comments on women deacons to the English-speaking media. So the question of women deacons languished in Rome until surfacing at the May 2016 meeting of the International Union of Superiors General, UISG, the worldwide membership organization for some 1,500 women religious general superiors. In advance of their meeting, Pope Francis asked the leadership to submit 6 questions. They included one about women deacons. Pointing out that women already served in diaconal ministries, the women asked, quote, what prevents the church from including women among permanent deacons, as was the case in the primitive church? Why not constitute an official commission to study the matter? And the Holy Father responded, quote, it seems that the role of the deaconesses was to help in the baptism of women with their immersion. For the sake of decorum, they baptized them, and they also anointed the body of women in baptism. And another curious fact, the Pope continued, when there was a judgment on a marriage because a husband beat his wife and she went to the bishop to lay a complaint, deaconesses were responsible for inspecting the bruises left on the woman's body from her husband's blows and for informing the bishop. I would like to constitute an official commission to study the question. I think it would be good for the church to clarify this point. I agree. And I will speak to the congregation in order to do something of this nature. Well, Pope Francis's words were electrifying. He in essence agreed that women deacons had a place in sacramental ministry, that women were considered competent to testify, and that he would establish a commission. And as it happened, just a few weeks later, on August 2nd, 2016, Francis named 12 commissioners, apparently chosen from among individuals nominated by CDF and the UISG. By late November 2016, the commission held the first of several meetings. The Pontifical Commission for the Study of the Diaconate of Women completed a document in June 2018, and eventually CDF staff prepared and Cardinal Ladaria submitted documents to the Pope. In October of 2018, the Synod on Young People, the Faith, and Vocational Discernment, also in Rome, produced a document that mentioned women 31 times and included pointed commentary on the treatment of girls and women worldwide, using terms like domination and discrimination. The final document noted that the Synod participants call for greater recognition of women in society, the inclusion of women in ecclesial decision-making processes, and specifically, as applied to women deacons, quote, the vocation to the permanent diaconate calls for greater attention because the full potential of this resource has yet to be tapped. In May of 2019, the Holy Father responded to the women religious initial request, and he gave what he termed a portion of the Pontifical Commission for the Study of the Diaconate of Women report to the sister presidents of the UISG at their first triennial meeting since asking for the study. I was present at that event. Pope Francis said he had more materials that they could request. Then, in October 2019, the Special Assembly of the Synod of Bishops on the Pan-Amazon region, the 9 South American countries of the Amazon River Basin, met. The post-synodal apostolic exhortation from the Synod is about to be promulgated, but the final document of the Synod reported, and I quote, in the many consultations carried out in the Amazon, the fundamental role of religious and lay women in the Church of the Amazon and its communities was recognized and emphasized, given the wealth of services they provide. In a large number of these consultations, the permanent diaconate for women was requested. This made it an important thing during the Synod. The Study Commission on the Diaconate of Women, which Pope Francis created in 2016, has already arrived as a commission at partial findings regarding the reality of the diaconate of women in the early centuries of the Church and its implications for today. We would therefore like to share our experiences and reflections with the commission, and we await its results. In his closing remarks to the Amazon Synod, Pope Francis said about the Pontifical Commission for the Study of the Diaconate of Women, I welcome the request to reconvene the commission and perhaps expand it with new members in order to continue to study the permanent diaconate that existed in the early Church. You know they reached an agreement among themselves, which however is unclear. I delivered this, the agreement, to the women religious, to the Union of Superiors General of Women Religious, who asked me to conduct this research. I delivered it to them, and now each of the theologians is investigating. Pope Francis continued, I will try to do it again with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and include new people in this commission. I welcome the challenge that you have given me that they may be heard. I accept the challenge, and there was great applause then. Some things emerged which should be reformed. The Church must always reform. Now, there have been other indications that the commission will be recalled. It was also mentioned at the Synod's closing press briefing, but nothing official has been announced. So let's review the argument. As individual research has continued and as Synods repeatedly asked for women to be restored to the ordained diaconate, a concerted effort has arisen to press two related points against women deacons. First, current and former curial officials are known to have argued that the 1994 apostolic letter of John Paul II, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, which outlaws women priests, applies as well to women deacons. Second, the so-called iconic argument, which states that a woman cannot image Christ, is given as the major reason women cannot be ordained as deacons. An example most recently, Cardinal Robert Sarah, the 74-year-old prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments since November 2014, wrote, connecting what he calls, quote, a weakening of celibacy with, quote, questions about the possibility of women being ordained as priests or deacons. Sarah continues, quote, this question, nevertheless, was settled definitively by St. John Paul II in the apostolic letter Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. Early in his essay, Sarah writes of the threefold ministry of deacons, priests, and bishops, without accounting for the distinctive nature of each. Neither does he consider the medieval development of the cursus honorum, the course of honor, which refused diaconal ordination to anyone not on the path to priesthood. Because women never entered the cursus honorum, tonsure, lector, porter, exorcist, lector, acolyte, subdeacon, deacon, priest, the female diaconate died out in the West by the close of the 12th century. But Sarah's argument, supported by a small chorus in Rome, supports a so-called, quote, unicity of orders, which states that because women cannot be ordained as priests, they cannot be ordained as deacons. Further, Sarah dismisses the documented histories of women deacons by stating without support that women, quote, were not the recipients of the sacrament of holy orders, that they were forbidden altar service, and that their, quote, sole liturgical function in the region of Syria would have been to perform the pre-baptismal anointing of the entire body of woman. Sarah also asserts that deaconesses were not ordained, but only blessed, and he cites one source. Sarah's overall perspective is that the, quote, cleverly orchestrated media campaigns are calling for the female diaconate, and he asks, quote, what is hidden behind these strange political demands? Well, in conclusion, obviously, the requests for women deacons are not political requests. The fact that women deacons are historically documented, doctrinally possible, and pastorally necessary guide the positive discussion. Proponents of the restoration of women to the ordained diaconate are perplexed by the resurgence of the argument that women cannot image Christ, the risen Lord, given that the whole church's constant teaching is that all are made in the image and likeness of God. The reduction of the concept of ordained ministry to a naive physicalism is both embarrassing and it is wrong. It would seem that this effort to deny women their full humanity, combined with the documented dismissal of women's intelligence and superstitious blood taboos that have evolved throughout Western history, are now relied upon to keep women away from the sacred. Yet the argument against women deacons is essentially an argument against women priests, even though the Catholic Church officially now understands the diaconate as not part of the priesthood. That is, the medieval Catholic practice of only ordaining as deacons men destined for priesthood has morphed into a reason not to ordain women deacons. The final document of the Pan-Amazon Synod is the basis of the post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which has not yet been released. I think it'll be out tomorrow, actually. The doctrinal decision on the restoration of women to the ordained diaconate may still be recommended, but the church as a whole seems to want women to be recognized as full participants and does not want to wait any longer. Thank you very much.
There are no words, Dr. Zagano, to express the organizing committee, but also the scientific committee of this symposium for your challenging presentation. you may not know, but in the so-called Orthodox circles, you are called the woman Theodoru of the Catholic Church. And we are grateful for your effort to rely on theological arguments concerning the restoration of the order of Deaconesses. We are going immediately to my colleague from Sofia, Emeritus Professor Ivan Dimitrov, but preliminary, I would ask a question to all three who have expressed similar concerns. Bishop from Africa, the Metropolitan of Nigeria, Zoya, about the so-called not successful attempt to revive in the great Russian church, and also you. What is behind this all? Why there is so much reservation and reaction? But the answer after the intervention by my colleague Ivan. We have the discussion of all three at the end.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
No, don't wait. You remain, okay?
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Should I start?
We can hear you.
Can I start?
Yes, please start. Thank you.
Okay. So,
Only Ivan.
thank you very much. Thank you very much. Greeting from Sofia, Bulgaria, just to the north of Thessaloniki. I appreciated very much the presentation, several presentations I could follow. My presentation is not so scholarly, but more taken from the real life of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. And I put it this title, the discussion about the diaconesses in the post-communist environment, having in mind the situation in my country. The change in the political regime in Eastern Europe has inevitably affected the whole life of the people in these countries, including the religious one. Feeling free to express their ideas and religious beliefs after the political changes, they also turned to the traditional Orthodox faith of their ancestors. And church clerics were suddenly faced with unprecedented challenges. People's interest in church life outweighed the clergy's physical capacity. Thus, in their quest to receive new believers and to care for them, the clergy failed to carry out their preaching mission. So it came to the paradox that because of a lot of work, they could not do their main job. In some of the churches, especially in the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, about I'm speaking, there is an acute shortage of clerics. Even so, our church is unable to engage other people to help clerics in their difficult work. Human resources are not enough for purely cultic duties, not to mention to spread the faith and to do social activity. And it is in these two areas that the diaconesses would be very helpful and useful. However, conservative-minded church leaders do not even dare to think of such a solution of the problem. Why, however, does the title of the paper refer to the post-communist environment? Because the environment always affects the people's thinking. Orthodox clerics in Eastern Europe, from decades of communism, have become accustomed to thinking and working predominantly in the preservation of faith and church practice, and now continue to oppose any ideas of change. What is more, such ideas and their careers are immediately branded as modernist, ecumenical, and are anti-church minded. Either way, the Deaconesses issue is on the agenda of the Orthodox Church as a whole, even though the individual synods of the local Orthodox churches do not pay attention to it. Moreover, the issue is not the result of pressure on the part of Orthodox women and their possible claims to entry into the clergy of the church, but is driven by the awareness that women's ministry, in whatever form is accepted and introduced, is vital about the activities of the Orthodox Church. About 1 year, about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to attend a liturgy in Germany in a parish of the Antiochian Patriarchate, and I saw there girls helping in the worship. In doing so, the Patriarchate, this Patriarchate, of course, contributes to the revival of ancient practices of participation of Deaconesses in Orthodox worship. Another example from my country. For the past several years, the priest who serves in the chapel of St. Clement of Ohrid, that's the patron of the Sofia University, and the chapel is in the building of the Theological faculty. This priest introduced also his lecturer of Christian philosophy, and the priest, in the same time, he introduced the participation of girls in Sticharion during the small and the grand entrance of the Holy Liturgy. It is a tradition in the last years that the whole families, entire families with their children come to celebrate the Holy Liturgy on Sundays and holidays in this faculty's chapel. And you can see that together with the boys, the girls also form an impressive procession of 15 to 20 children. And since it is not advisable for all of these children, sometimes they are also 3-4 years old children, it is not advisable to wear candles. So a set of dozens of medium and small size icons have been created for the children to wear in front of their breast during the entrances. Of course, some clarification need to be made. First, the girls do not enter the altar. In their ministry is only in the common part of the temple, the so-called naos or naos. Secondly, they simply join the number of boys who help in a similar way, but also are allowed to enter the altar. And third, the girls do not have horarion on their robes, just as boys and men do. This is an innovation that I have not seen elsewhere in my country. According to the priest, called, his name is Father Sava, Savas Kokurev, who initiated this participation of the girls. He did that, this practice after a Christmas party where the boys and girls were dressed in robes as small angels. He came up with the idea that the children with these robes could be engaged during part of the Holy Liturgy, because otherwise it is difficult to keep the children's attention during the long Orthodox services, you know. We must say, however, that some people resent this innovation because girls are not accepted to serve in the church, and as women are also not. And here we come to the paradox. In the Orthodox Church, especially in the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, the main mass of worshippers in the churches are women, but they are not recognized the right to participate, at least as deaconesses, as servants, also in the altar. Of course, there are some exceptions, such as using elderly women for altar servants, because there are no men to do this job, and also largely for temple, for the church work in the church as candle makers, cleaners, etc. Of course, very low duties. Women are very active also in the whole parish life, in singing during the worship, in educational work, also in social activities, and many others, commonly referred in our common language as the Martha's part. Nevertheless, the true Orthodox Christians and clerics especially cannot even imagine that a woman can be introduced into the lower degree of clerical ministry. In this case, the argument of the history and the practice of the Orthodox Church, some of them of these arguments we heard also in the previous presentations. These arguments may be of little help because the guardians of the tradition are not interested in arguments. They know only one thing: this cannot be done, to ordain women for diaconesses. They are not interested in whether and for what reason women can be ordained diaconesses. They only know it cannot. Everybody who says the opposite is a modernist, certainly ecumenist, and in generally traitor to orthodoxy. These opponents of the diaconesses idea are not interested in arguments such as the fact that there are not enough men for clerical ministry, that it is good to include women in the deacon degree because women work, the women work easier, better, and more successfully with other people. Of course, they accept in theory, the people who are against the idea accept the theory that man and woman are equal vessels of God's mercy and grace, but it cannot. So this is no discussion, there is no discussion at all about the diaconesses, women diaconesses. How I see the future of this issue among the leadership clergy of the Bulgarian Church? Maybe you would ask. In general, the bishops will answer that all is well and so it must go on. One could hear this answer also from the majority of the clergy as well as from many of the active Christians. Moreover, the Orthodox are convinced, as in the decades of the state atheism, that the primary duty of every Orthodox Christian is to preserve, to keep the Orthodox heritage and nothing more. In short, there is no discussion about diaconesses. I do not think that any initiative can be expected in this regard by the leadership of the Bulgarian Church. And there are no conditions at the lower level to be offered anything. To lower level, I mean lower clergy, priests, and lay people. Now, if something new would be offered at a pan-Orthodox level, will it be accepted by in my church? That's a difficult question. To get away with a smile from the answer, I would say, can really anything be decided and accepted at a pan-Orthodox level in the present situation? So, the worshippers in our Orthodox churches will continue to be a female community led by a man. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Now you have almost completed the puzzle, and not only Russia, Africa, the whole Orthodox world, the Catholic Church, but also Bulgaria and the Balkans have the same concern in one way or another. Unfortunately, we don't have more than 10 minutes, but I would like to ask you as quickly as possible, or the way you decide, just because we are collecting concerns in order that, according to the recommendation of many scholars from all over the world, to continue the support, not only of our Orthodox Church, but also in general the support of the Church of Christ to come to a theological decision and eventually restore this the possibility of women becoming deacons to continue this diaconal service of our church. Your Eminence, about this, we start from you, and then we'll go to Dr. Zagano.
Okay. Good evening to everybody. I would like to thank, just one comment to the presentation of Dr. Zagano from the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not surprised by the position of Cardinal or Archbishop Sarah. Yesterday I was arguing here in my presentation that my fear on this is not the reaction from within other places, other churches out of Africa, but rather the opposition, the reaction from within. And in our church, in the Orthodox Church of Africa, we have also, I noticed the same problem. The indigenous people are extremely skeptical. Has to do, as I argued yesterday, with a lot of cultural prejudices that they have invaded the gospel instead of the other way around. I'm very surprised. I know very well in the Roman Catholic Church of Nigeria, wonderful women, especially nuns that I'm related with, professors, open-minded, fresh minds, despite the age, extremely fresh minds. One particular one, Professor Teresa Okure, she's I would say, though we've never met, but we speak often on phone, she has been my mentor, if I'm allowed to say, in some issues. So I really don't know how we're going to tackle the problem in Africa. I'm sure that you will face the same problems as already I hear that you face from the time that the nuns are permitted to share communion. Friends of mine, Catholics, said that if you go to a big parish where the priest has to share communion to hundreds upon hundreds, and they have as an assistant a nun, you will see that almost nobody goes to the queue where the nun is sharing the communion, but they will prefer to go and wait patiently and for hours to go to the male, to the priest or the deacon who will share the communion. So despite all that, I think that we have, I will agree with Professor Vassiliadis, that we have to be prayerful and continue fighting through fighting, first of all, the theological illiteracy among the clergy and among our faithful. And I pray that in your case, that your dynamic Bishop of Rome will manage really to make a change, And I also believe that God will also strengthen the rest of us in the various jurisdictions in the Orthodox world to be able to turn the table around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Eminence. And Phyllis, you understand how important the initiative of Pope Francis is, but we are very much concerned about this hesitation to go further. And since we are now among sisters and brothers between the Catholics and the Orthodox, I wonder whether there is a possibility of Pope Francis to issue another Utonum Sint, an invitation to help not solve the primacy problem, but to help the diaconia problem. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Eminence, for your question, and Petros. I am the only person on the planet not upset about the amount of time that it's taking Rome to say something. And I think, when I'm there, I have the privilege of living in Casa Santa Marta, and I see the Pope almost every day. Certainly not to speak to him, but from my experience, he is a man of deep discernment and deep prayer. I know the problems in Africa from talking to African Catholic bishops and cardinals. I think there would be greater resistance there in some cases. However, in Ghana, for example, an archbishop and a bishop were kidding around about which one of them was going to bring me home to Ghana to make me a deacon, because they needed help over there. So, but I think the question as it has arisen in the Amazonia, the Synod for the Pan-Amazon, it was very, very strongly requested of the 12 language groups. Something like 9 language groups said, come on, stop waiting, just do it. Can Francis do it? Of course he can. All he needs to do is write a motu proprio saying that only a baptized male is validly ordained priest or bishop. The current canon 1024, in my study, the Catholic canon 1024 relates to the canon of 1917, which was canon, I think, 968, which came from the medieval times with Grecian's collection of canons. And at that time, when Grecian was writing the canon about ordination, he was writing about priesthood. so the arguments that are adduced right now against my work are that women cannot be priests. All of the arguments against women priests are adduced against women deacons. But the tradition of women deacons is solid. The point that women cannot image Christ, while it has been discredited theologically, is still presented. I am so happy to tell you, Petros, my book just came yesterday. So it's
Icons of Christ, yeah.
Women Icons of Christ, you know, listen to me. Women can indeed image the risen Lord. The ancient taboos about women being dirty and unclean and therefore unable to approach the sacred, be near the sacred, certainly I can understand where in certain communities people will not approach a woman to share communion because of these ancient taboos. But so the 2 points, as I mentioned, need to be clearly understood, and they are clearly understood by the theologians. I don't mean to sell Ratzinger short. He's an honest theologian. He had from 1982 to 2013 to outlaw women deacons. He did not because he cannot. And I have been told, I was told many years ago by the highest ranking woman in the Vatican, they can't say no. They just don't want to say yes. So I'll just tell you one short story and then give up the floor. Years ago, someone asked His Old Holiness Bartholomew, what about women deacons? And he said, we don't want to get ahead of the Catholics on this. And about the same time, somebody asked Cardinal O'Malley the same question, what about women deacons? And he said, we don't want to go against the Orthodox. So I think your point is very well taken. We need to get together on this.
I'm afraid we have to continue tomorrow. I see patiently my colleague, Professor Paul Ladouceur, is waiting at least to intervene again, but we have to finish and give many, many thanks to our technician who, despite his family health problems, has stayed till this hour with us. And please, let's express our gratitude. And we continue with